Thanks. I had a criticism and a question, and unfortunately my question, which concerned the relationship between the Privilege and Immunities Clauses, the citizenship rights in that, and the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause, Judd has anticipated and has already answered in his reply to Ryan. So I'm left with my criticism, and that it would also apply to A.J. Balia's papers as well, and that is that all this discovery of new historical concepts after I've published a book and other area in this area, this really needs to stop. I just want to say that. And since I have no question, I'm just going to let it go at that.
Judd, love this paper, as you know, and I think we mostly agree. My question is, can you be a general citizen without being either a state citizen or a United States citizen? And if the answer to that is no, what work does it do in your paper to identify both general citizenship rights and general citizenship, as opposed to just general citizenship rights that either come by virtue of being a state citizen or a United States citizen? Answer, but I'll catch the recording.
Thank you for the paper, Judd. I learned a lot, and I think I'm on board with much of what you say, perhaps most of what you say at this point, and who knows where that goes. I have two suggestions for incorporating the Treaty of Paris into your analysis of the relationship between subjecthood and citizenship on the one hand, and also your discussion of sovereignty and where sovereignty lay before the Articles of Confederation. So let me deal with that second thing first. So as I understand the passage on the bottom of 15 and the top of 16, the third word on 16, the themselves there, is referring back to the states, and you're saying that sovereignty already resided in the states. So Article 1 of the Treaty of Paris, which the states ratified, is conventionally understood, and certainly there's a reading of the text that supports this as transferring sovereignty from the king to the states. So that does seem to be counter evidence and also a very important piece of counter evidence. You might read Article 1 of the Treaty of Paris as declaratory, and that would save your position, but that's not the way anyone else has read it, and so you might want to say something about that. With respect to your discussion of the relationship of being a subject and being a citizen, right, you might want to consider Article 7 of the Treaty of Paris, which clearly says that the people in Britain are subjects and not citizens, and that the people of the United States, or of the states that are adhere to the treaty, are citizens, and it just, I don't think it can be fairly read as saying that they are subjects also. At any rate, it seems to be using the two terms in a way such that they are mutually exclusive, and you have a different view. So I am not saying you're wrong about anything. I'm just suggesting to you that the Treaty of Paris is highly salient, and that you might want to account for Article 1 and Article 7 in your treatment of these issues.
Great. Thanks. Randy, point taken. Although I do have to say, we sketched this out 2 years ago on a napkin over lunch, so you were warned. Yeah, no, you were very helpful. I appreciate it. Alon, is Alon still here? No, but I'll go ahead and answer. So I do think Alon's point is right, which is that, or maybe it's not a point, but a sort of implied premise of his question. General citizenship is not free-floating. It's something that's attached to either state citizenship or national citizenship or both. Because the idea is federative, it's not referring to membership in a polity, but somebody, a citizen is a membership of some polity, maybe of two polities, in which case you have the ternary view that I articulated. So I don't have the view that general citizenship is detached from state citizenship or national citizenship, but I do think it's helpful to conceptualize this third relationship because that third relationship has this federative character, which means that the underlying assumption about how the rights are defined and enforced is not necessarily going to map on to what we think of today as federal constitutional law, which is sort of creating national rights that are enforceable by national institutions. So it's, or state constitutional law, which is creating rights that are solely enforceable and identified through state institutions. So because the concept of federative citizenship sort of helps articulate why it might be that people are viewing these rights in ways that don't quite map onto our conceptual structure, I think it's helpful. That said, I do think it's right that it's possible to have the idea of general citizenship rights without having the idea of general citizenship. And I think that's roughly what the dissenters in the slaughterhouse cases are thinking. They've sort of lost the idea of a federative idea of general citizenship, at least outside the context of Article 4, and yet they seem to have the kind of conceptual structure for thinking about general citizenship rights in the way that I've described, which is to say rights that are defined by general fundamental law and regulable by the states, but nonetheless enforceable by federal institutions. I think that's the view taken by the slaughterhouse dissenters. Larry, I really appreciate it. I'll have to go back and take a look at the Treaty of Paris. I mean, I do want to say that sovereignty in the way I'm using it is different than sovereign authority. So it could be that the king has some sovereign authority, but the king is not sovereign in the sense of the king is not the source of ultimate power within the polity. And I think that might help do a little bit of work here. So the Americans are independent already by their own proclamation in the mid-1770s pamphlet literature. That doesn't make them independent from the king's authority. It means they're sovereign, but they're still subjects. And so I think that the Treaty of Paris, although I haven't looked into this at all, would likely reflect that sort of dual understanding. But I'll have to take a look. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next trio is me, David Upham, and Michael McConnell. So my question is about the most burning implication of your paper in the area of diversity jurisdiction. And so when you think about what diversity jurisdiction is, I was wondering, to me it seems that it partakes of some of this federative character in that if there were only one state in the United States, you wouldn't need the diversity jurisdiction. So in that sense, it obviously has to do with the rights of people against citizens, rights of citizens of states against citizens of other states. On the other hand, it seems like clearly a right of national citizenship in that it has to do with the Article 3 courts, and if there weren't a national government, you wouldn't have that right. And it seems that in the earliest part of the 19th century in Hepburn, as you note, there was the argument of counsel was made that limiting diversity jurisdiction to citizens of a state and taking it away from citizens of the District of Columbia would deprive them of the general rights of citizens. But the key thing there is that was an argument of counsel, right? And Marshall didn't seem to think in Hepburn that citizens of DC had these general citizenship rights. But then later on in the paper, you note that Taney thought that the right to sue in diversity jurisdiction was a right of general citizenship. That seems, as I began by saying, that also makes some sense. So which is it? And what is that? And if it is the case that Taney is right, then is your paper an argument that Tidewater was rightly decided on originalist grounds because it restored general citizenship rights.
2 points. One is on your early account of the American colonial to the revolutionary period. I wonder if you, this might be helpful in support of your thesis. Prior to, as the Declaration of Independence says, and all of my comments are about the Declaration ultimately, there is already an existing citizenship. There are fellow citizens mentioned. And those fellow citizens are not fellow citizens of the British Empire. The people of America already exist as a people, not just 13 colonies, before 1776. They have rights around the British Empire as British subjects. They have a common allegiance, but they also have something vis-a-vis one another that exists even before the United States exists. So there's an American citizenry, then there's the United States citizenry, and the Constitution, by implication, having that 9-year rule for senators, says that it existed before the Articles. And along those same lines, what the Articles does by its own terms is not to create but perpetuate and secure something already existing, the unity between the one people of the several states. I think that might be an origin of a third place rather than looking to sovereignties. A colony and a king, or a colony, a state, and the federal government. There's something else that seems to precede that. And one other point about looking for the privileges of citizenship in things that only citizens enjoy. The language of Corfield is that it belongs of right to the citizens of all free governments. It's not the case, however, that nobody else enjoys those things. Blackstone says that aliens can trade as a matter of indulgence. Subjects can trade as a matter of right. There's prudence, there's kindness, there's economic policy involved in allowing people to travel in your country, engage in work, acquire real as well as personal property, participate in your political debates, broadcast information about your presidential candidates that may perhaps not belong to the whole human race. But you might allow something to a certain extent. But I think that's different qualitatively from the right to be protected by local anti-homicide laws. At least for myself, I would consider any country in the world, if they said, well, we're not going to protect your life against kidnapping, that's a bad country, not a different one. But if I said, well, why can't I participate in a political rally here, I'm asking for something qualitatively different, which is also different from a right to be king or a right to vote.
Something that worries me about, I think, this otherwise very plausible account is why it did not inspire the same kind of objection that Bingham's first draft of the 14th Amendment did, which you may recall says, I didn't bring my notes, but it says something to the effect of, Congress has authority to guarantee all rights of life, liberty, and property, the equal rights of all life, liberty, and property. And the problem with that is that, according to those who opposed it, and it was voted down, was that meant that Congress had a power to have a general law about what rights of life, liberty, and property we would have, which is to say a general police power. And so it was sent back to committee, and then it comes back in different form that eliminates that possibility. But if you're right about general citizenship rights and being in the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and then there is still in Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, why doesn't that excite the same opposition?
Mila, I'm going to do the intellectual historian cop-out and say there were differing views. But I'll add something, which is the relationship between citizenship under Article 4 and citizenship for purposes of the Diversity Jurisdiction Clause is just contested. And so you see different perspectives about that. Some people think that for purposes of diversity jurisdiction, the relevant citizenship is actually state citizenship, whereas for Article 4, it's general citizenship. And then some people think it's general citizenship for both. And I haven't tried to adjudicate which side is right, but I've definitely seen both perspectives in the sources. David, I appreciate this. I mean, I don't want to be taking a position that the nationalists are wrong. So I definitely don't want to take the view that, let's say, James Wilson, or even the view perhaps reflected in the Declaration of Independence itself, is a sort of incorrect understanding. So I'm not associating myself with AJ's paper in that sense, right? You guys are taking a position about the nature of sovereignty at the founding, and I'm not trying to do that. That said, I think that most of the thinking about citizenship rights in the mode that I'm talking about flows from a federative understanding of what it is that at least Article 4 is doing. And I'm not sure it's required that I take a position with respect to nationhood under the Articles, for the very same reason that I don't think one needs to take a position about nationhood under the Constitution. That is, it's possible to say you have general citizenship rights in a sort of federative sense, regardless of whether the United States is a nation in the Articles, and regardless of whether the United States is a nation under the Constitution. You know, Calhoun and Salmon Chase can agree about this, right? They can agree about the nature of Article 4, privileges and immunities, even though they're disagreeing in really profound ways about nationhood. Michael, I think that the key difference is not in anything that's said about the privileges or immunities clause. It's about the addition of an explicit state action requirement. And so by adding a state action requirement, at least for those people who are thinking about the problem in terms of giving the federal government power it otherwise lacked, there would not then be a general power of bringing every common law suit into federal court. That said, the radical Republicans who think that there's regardless of what the 14th Amendment says, a national social compact that recognizes these rights, general citizenship rights, as rights of national citizenship, think that there actually is an ability to bring all of these claims directly into federal court, and they are unconcerned about problems of state action. And you see that in the 1870s Civil Rights Act debates. So I think that's the key distinction. I may be missing something here, but I don't think it has to do with anything involving a change in language in the Privileges or Immunities Clause. Instead, it has to do with the shift by Bingham, rather than saying the federal government has the power to protect equal rights. It's a shift to saying no state shall abridge privileges or immunities or deny equal protection. And then to confer federal power to enforce that is to confer federal power in the event of state abridgment, not in a sort of primary sense, which I think is what Bingham was anticipating all along. I don't think he was reading the first draft in the way that other folks were concerned about, or that I don't think he was designing the first draft in a way other folks were concerned about, but the way he had written it without a sort of no state shall structure at least opened up the possibility that what he was doing in the 14th Amendment was recognizing the rights themselves. And what I want to add here, which I think is important, is this is very much tied to the way Bingham is thinking about Barron. So Bingham thinks that it's different to recognize the rights themselves, in which case there's an accompanying power to enforce those rights with respect to violations by anybody, including private actors, versus recognizing that some government shall not abridge the rights, in which case it's just about the relationship between the rights and that particular government. So which is just a crucial distinction when it comes to the state action debates.
So
I was hoping you could say more about political rights and civil rights and the distinction and how this explains what Bingham is up to in March 1866. So March, he has this comment. He's complaining about a draft of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that gives equality in civil rights, and he says civil rights includes all political rights. And I don't understand how looking at general citizenship is going to help reconcile that with what he says later about the 14th Amendment when he says, well, Section 2 makes it obvious that it doesn't include political rights. And in general, I'm just, I guess I'd encourage you to, when you do, get the final reading of the Privileges or Immunities Clause together, distinguish active citizenship from passive citizenship. So active citizenship is the right to control the government, but it's not included. Passive citizenship is the right to be treated properly by the government. That's what the Privileges or Immunities Clause was about. And Bingham just sometimes said things that were a little bit off. And the March 9th thing was one of them, I think.
I love the appearance of the diversity jurisdiction, general law, and general constitutional law and all this. That's really interesting. I want to learn more about how that was manifest in actual diversity cases. But I want to ask about Curtis and Dred Scott, and maybe Story thought basically the same things. Just before leaving on Thursday, I took a very quick look at Curtis's opinion in Dred Scott, and saw that he does talk about general citizenship. And his way of thinking, though, and your diagram shows, is states confer state citizenship. That brings with it United States citizenship. It also brings with it the privileges and immunities of state citizenship, a subset of which are the privileges and immunities of state citizenship that are common, and that's the overlap zone, or at least according to some people, the overlap zone, but I think not to Curtis. And I can see how somebody who had the beliefs about the law that Curtis did would think, because one thing you stress is the connection between the way people use terminology and their substantive beliefs about the content of the law. I could see somebody like Curtis thinking, well, there's a sense in which those citizenship rights are rights of citizens of the United States, even though they're not rights of United States citizenship, because they don't come from federal citizenship and they don't come from federal law. But that somebody who had Curtis's views would think that was, well, strictly speaking correct, but not the way I would want to, not the terminology I would use to describe that body of citizens' rights, the general citizenship rights. Is that right?
Thanks, Professor Campbell. I thought it was a really great piece. I enjoyed it a lot. I have a couple of question comments, and they probably relate more to the implications for your piece on the original understanding of the 14th Amendment. So what is the status of anti-discrimination and an anti-discrimination norm or an anti-discrimination rule? Is it one of these privileges or immunities of these general citizenship rights that you can't be discriminated against with respect to the others, or is it something about the comity clause and something about the 14th Amendment and like abridgment that prevents the states from discriminating with respect to them? Is that anti-discrimination norm one of the privileges or immunities, or is it part of the mechanism in the text for securing those rights, for protecting those rights? I also was wondering how, if at all, the shifting concepts of citizenship affect how we understand the privileges or immunities. So you talk about the radical view and maybe the Calhoun view that there's national citizenship. It's more binary than tertiary, national citizenship and state citizenship rights, and how that shifting to a national citizenship, more of an acceptance of a national citizenship than a general citizenship, affects the 14th Amendment. So you were talking about the slaughterhouse dissents, and I'm wondering if that's sort of what happens is they nationalize these general citizenship rights. So, and what that means is these general citizenship rights now belong to citizens of the United States. the content of these rights is such that states can regulate them, but the federal government can protect them. And so that's connecting sort of the Bingham view with the radical view that they are now nationalized, and what it means for them to be nationalized is they're protectable by the federal government, but regulable by the states. And then kind of building on your response to Professor McConnell's point, where I can't remember the exact language of Bingham's first draft, but is there a difference between Section 5 enforcement and police powers regulation? So is it possible that the power in Section 5 to enforce is to, Congress can prevent abridgments or something like that, and the necessary and proper language from Bingham's first draft sounded like regulation, and that's something only states can do?
Thanks. Chris, I'm not sure if this is going to help, but my basic approach here is to say Bingham is mostly coherent. So I'm not taking the view that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And here's the basic scheme, and maybe this won't answer the March 9th evidence, but I'll give it a shot here and see what you think. The basic scheme is political rights are not rights shared among the citizens of the several states under Article 4. Those are the rights that are being captured by the Privileges or Immunities Clause, and therefore the Privileges or Immunities Clause is not capturing any political rights. But there are other senses of citizenship rights that are out there. Some of those might be at the state level, some of them might be national. And so it's totally plausible in a debate over something like Section 2 of the 14th Amendment to make references to rights of national citizenship as including political rights, even though rights of general citizenship don't include political rights. So it's just picking up, it's drawing the line at John's box number 3 rather than reaching across into John's box number 4. And I think that's what Bingham's position is. That is, box number 4 is a way of understanding what rights of state citizenship entail. Those rights include voting rights. If we were in box, I'm getting a little lost now, John, but I think box number 2, we're dealing with national citizenship rights. Voting's in that category. But the thing that Bingham is insisting is that in box number 3, which is the general citizenship rights, we don't have any voting rights. So voting rights are conferred as a matter of one's membership in a polity, which is to say your co-equal membership in the national body politic or your co-equal membership in the state body politic. And because of that, political rights just aren't part of the concept of general citizenship. So maybe you can convince me of the active versus passive idea as being helpful here some way, but I think that the way I view political rights is just political rights are rights that attach to the notion of citizenship that refers to membership in a body politic. And that's just not what general citizenship was. It was a different it was a different notion of citizenship. It was a notion of citizenship that was sort of related to the subjecthood concept in the colonial period, and somebody in North Carolina could not go into Virginia as a subject of the king and vote in Virginia. For the very same reason, somebody under Article 4 can't go from one state into another state and vote. And so it has to do with sort of the conceptual idea of citizenship that we're dealing with, whether it's membership in a polity or whether it's this sort of federative family idea that's doing the work rather than active versus passive. But at least that's the argument. And then whether or not Bingham actually held that view, we got to go back to the evidence and try to adjudicate. But that's at least what I'm positing. John, yeah, I'm not sure what to do with Curtis. I mean, I do want to use Curtis in a very loose way to say that there's this idea of general citizenship out there that seems to be commonly held, but I don't want to put much emphasis on Curtis because, as Ryan says, Curtis is like not buying into the basic framework of fundamental rights. So I think you're right to push me there. And I don't have a good answer. Again, I'm not trying to say everybody is buying into the notion of fundamental rights in the same way. Adam, these are super questions. I mean, the enforcement and police power regulation question is just hugely important. Figuring out what the relative lines of interpretive authority are and regulatory authority, and I don't have answers to those yet. I think that's part of the next project. So I don't want to say anything yet that is going to prejudice my own thinking on this. In terms of the anti-discrimination idea, I mean, one answer here is Chris's answer, which is that there's just a separate right of anti-discrimination that's recognized as a right of co-equal citizenship, and that very well might be right. You don't need that to have anti-discrimination, though. You can say, as a matter of equal fundamental rights, there's a right of equality because you hold those rights equally. And so the idea of anti-discrimination is just inherent in the idea of having equal fundamental rights. Another way of getting basically at the same idea is to say the rights are regulable, but there are limits on what counts as a valid regulation, and that there's a notion of non-discrimination based into, like, sort of built into the idea of permissible regulation. So either of those ways, I think, gets you there.
It's odd. I'm surprised I'm the first person, I think, to raise another aspect of this paper, which is the end of the paper, which raises questions about originalism, very basic questions. This, of course, is a conference about originalism. One reason, and it sort of confirms my view, that that portion of the paper might be lost in such a long paper because it's so short, and while it's interesting, I'm not quite sure it's entirely clear or how it fits into originalist theory, and that may suggest that should be another paper, that you really should think more directly about that. So let me raise my queries, which is I don't entirely understand how this is a direct challenge to some of the fundamentals of many of the theories and theorists, including people in the room. I certainly take the point that people had different views, and their views were different, maybe fundamentally, because it was connected to a web of beliefs about very other fundamental concepts. But I'm not sure why that makes things so different from trying to figure out the meanings of language, which often are always connected to fundamentally, to other concepts other than the actual words that are on the page. We do the best we can, and either we decide, well, it's just indeterminate, or we try to take the best view we have. I'm not sure why this disagreement undermines that enterprise. Connected to that, and is that this is not the only thing going on. I'm perplexed a little at the end of the paper. Again, this is right at the end. We talk about voting rights, again, very naively. I'm not a 14th Amendment expert at all. I thought the real problem with having voting rights is not these complexities, but looking at the 15th Amendment, and there they focus on voting rights. So it's pretty obvious that the 14th Amendment doesn't focus on voting rights for that reason, even if some people had a concept that could go into it, because we have some legal rules of understanding that suggest that, well, if very close in time, people created an amendment to deal with something, well, it's probably not the other amendment that dealt with it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have needed the 15th Amendment. A very simple-minded argument. So I wonder whether you'd say a little more about that. As I say, I think this is obviously, I think, going to be a new issue in originalism. G. Knapp's book raises it, but it might be worth even a longer treatment than I see in this paper.
Love the paper, Judd. mentioned this, you and I started talking about this before, but I thought I'd throw it out there now, that I'm curious, I'm struggling a little bit to understand what it means to say that these general citizenship rights are federative in nature, given the fact that a big category of them, you say, are what would often be referred to even at the time as natural law rights. And I don't take natural law rights to depend on the existence of any sort of federation. In other words, if you imagined that the 13 colonies after the Civil War, they couldn't strike a deal in the Articles of Confederation, and they just decided to part ways and go off as 13 nations, presumably they would have recognized many of the rights that you are categorizing in this paper as general citizenship rights, despite the absence in that case of any sort of federative agreement among them. And so, I mean, I think you're saying that within our constitutional system, these end up being federative rights in some meaningful way, but I guess I'd like to hear more about that.
Judd, loved the paper until around page 69, 70, 71, and 72 for reasons that I am sure you can imagine. It's the part where you talk about what the Constitution just is and unreflective originalist assumptions about what the Constitution is. I think it's worth pulling apart two distinctive criticisms that share a family resemblance and thus can invite some confusion. First, there's Cass Sunstein's "There is nothing that interpretation just is" article that attacks originalists for trying to argue that original meaning or commitment to original meaning just falls out of the nature of interpretation. So that's a claim that originalists have made about the nature of interpretation. Separate from that is the argument that there's something about a constitution as such that is just a written text. At this point, with the citation that you offer with a litany of exceptions to this supposed general rule, I don't think that it's enough for you to say it's an impressionable claim that originalists are just way too comfortable with the assumption of a written text and they're not serious about constitutional ontology. Of course, the citations to GNAP and the score are, don't help from my perspective because I think that he mischaracterizes the state of originalist reflection about this. And more generally, like John, I wondered exactly why this section, or why you think that your findings in this article really do call into question in a very global way how originalists understand their project. Because, just speaking as an originalist who thinks of the Constitution as a text, like, everything you're doing here is good. And then there's this section that suggests, I should revisit a lot of things that I've actually thought a lot about and agree with you about. So I'm just kind of left in this state where, I like your stuff, and this part I found irritating.
Great, thanks. So I'm aiming for thought-provoking, not irritating, but may miscalibrate a little bit. So here's one way to sort of tee it up. If we go back and we're putting ourselves in the shoe, and I'm writing here as an intellectual historian, so I'm not trying to say this is the right way of doing originalist methodology. But if we go back and try to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody approaching how to read the Constitution in, let's say, 1868, it seems to me that what they would start with is an assumption about the nature of the Union, and that assumption would then guide the way that they read the Commerce Clause and the 14th Amendment. So they're not starting with an assumption that the Constitution is the text and its meaning is fixed in 1789 versus 1868, and that if there's a difference in ways of thinking about the nature of the Union between 1789 and 1868, those meanings are irrelevant for constitutional interpretation because the meaning of the text was fixed at the time that the text was enacted. I don't think they were thinking in that way in 1868. Now, I may be wrong about that, But I think that the dominant approach to constitutional interpretation in the 19th century was to start with a perspective about the nature of the Union, and then that perspective about the nature of the Union guided everything else that followed, including the readings of the original Constitution and the 14th Amendment. So I hope that's helpful for just at least conveying to you and John what I'm trying to get at. In this paper, I'm trying to say that with evidence from specifically debates about the privileges or immunities concept. So I've not provided a sort of broad enough set of evidence to justify the claim in the breadth that it has, and that's right. But that's the basic sort of critique that I'm trying to make. The other thing that I would say that might be relevant here, perhaps helping John out with his sort of confusion, is I think you're right, John, in a limited sense, which is there would have been a difference of agreement about what the text was referring to in the 14th Amendment, and then an originalist would, again, I don't want to unify everybody in the room, but the typical move then is to say, okay, well, what's the right underlying premise for reading that text? There's a disagreement, and we've got to figure out what to do at that point, and we go behind it. I'm fine to take all that on board. Again, I'm not trying to write an originalist paper, so you guys do what you want. But it does seem to me that the challenge here is that for the radical Republicans, they wouldn't have actually thought of the 14th Amendment itself as being the source of the various principles that they were interpreting. So they would have thought that the rights exist, they were declared in the Declaration, and then they would have thought that there's an inherent power to enforce the rights inherent in the nature of things. When there's a recognition of rights in the social contract, it comes with the power of the government to enforce the rights. And so I think that's just a different perspective about what the text is doing. And so you may be able, as a textualist, to get to all the right answers right here, meaning reflective of whatever it is that the people back then were thinking. But you're not doing so in a way that is consistent with the way that they would have thought about the problem. And so whether that's actually a problem for originalists, I leave up to you guys, but that's at least the sort of critique that I was trying to levy. Tom, so two things here. One is I agree that you can have an idea of general citizenship rights without the idea of general citizenship. I think this is actually really important for what I want to say about the radical Republican view, which is that they actually held in the 1860s that there were these general citizenship rights, but assimilated them into a notion of national citizenship, not general citizenship. And so I think it's actually really important to my argument in that sense. I also think it's right that you could have 13 independent colonies, no Articles of Confederation, and an idea that the various rights being recognized as a matter of each state, independent state's fundamental law, were a product of general fundamental law. And you can do that in the same way that people in North Carolina are citing English precedent in 1890. Right? So you can have this idea of general law that's common across jurisdictions, even if there's no political relationship between the jurisdictions. As a contingent matter, it happens that that's not our story, except for insofar as we're dealing with England, which actually did politically separate, and yet the general law is viewed as, in some sense, reciprocal well through the early 1900s. But I think that's right. The other thing that I want to add here that maybe will be helpful in thinking about the analog to diversity jurisdiction is what I want to say in this paper is basically the model of the 14th Amendment is to extend diversity jurisdiction over this class of cases, not just between citizens of differing states, but citizens of a single state. Now, at that point, I'm making a mash of the very idea of diversity jurisdiction, which is diversity, and so I'm saying it's now the diversity and non-diversity jurisdiction concept. But the basic idea is there might be a federal power of enforcement a la diversity jurisdiction without nationalizing the rights themselves. And I see that as what Bingham is viewing as the model for the 14th Amendment. That is, it's effectively enforcing general fundamental rights in exactly the same way that they would have been enforced in diversity cases. But now we're pulling them in and allowing them to be enforced with respect to somebody's claim against their own state.
Our last question goes to Larry Solom.
So if I can just follow up on Evan for a moment. The thing I would say about that part of the paper is that I don't think you're giving full credit to originalism for the way that it incorporates the kinds of ideas that you are contrasting with originalism. So just to take sort of natural rights, social contract ideas, I think good originalism has to take into account the way that the text would have been understood given the background ideas of the time. I think all good originalists think exactly that, and that has implications for the interpretation of many individual provisions in the Constitution. So, including, for example, the First Amendment and your work on the First Amendment, Randy's work on the Ninth Amendment, et cetera. If you are saying something much more assertive, something much more, something much stronger than that, that their conception was that social contract theory or natural rights theory overrides the constitutional text, then I just don't think you have any evidence for that in a paper like this one. And you don't have an articulation of what theory, what constitutional theory you think they had that's inconsistent with originalism in this way. So I would urge you, if you in fact mean to pursue this critique, to develop the critique more fully. But I would also urge you to consider the ways in which contemporary originalists take on board everything I actually see here in this paper and in many of your other papers.
Please join me in thanking Judd and Ryan.